look, about rape and adultery, the philosophy of the whole thing about adultery is, of course, from a Muslim viewpoint, an Islamic viewpoint, is to say you have to avoid this because it's something which is very grave, and you have to know that from a spiritual viewpoint. By putting 4 witnesses, the objective, the purpose was to protect the people doing it, which was exactly, it will be stupid and crazy for a man and a woman to put themselves in a situation where they can be seen at the same time by 4 people. It's just crazy and quite impossible. Okay, it was to protect them. So what they are doing with this kind of, imposed adultery is just to do exactly the other way, which is now to put all the burden on the woman. He has to come and to ask her rapist to be totally stupid to do it in front of 4. So it's absolutely unacceptable. This is not Islamic. It's just a way to protect the man, to protect people who are doing something which is even more grave, more unacceptable than adultery per se, which is to force a woman. So now to put the burden and even to target the woman in order for her to come with the witnesses is unacceptable. And this is totally against the Islamic philosophy of law in that field, which is when there is rape, and a rape is unacceptable, and we have to condemn the people who are doing it. There is no way to protect the rapists. So here there is something which is coming from an Islamic, and we have to be even harsher with the rapist from an Islamic viewpoint than to do it the other way around. So it's once again, as a Muslim, I'm asking myself how Muslim scholars or people could come with such idea. There is something which is really vicious in the way they are reading the sources, and not only I disagree with that, but I condemn it, and I will be the first to act against it, say it's not acceptable, and we have to struggle against it in the name of our religion. It's anti-Islamic, it's not non-Islamic, it's anti the whole philosophy of Islam. So we'll never accept something like that.
He cannot kill a woman just because he thinks that she did so or something happened. The woman might have her defense. She might claim that she was raped. He cannot have any right way for inquiry to make sure that she was by her own will choose to do so. So just killing human beings on rumor or on something circulating, this is not the Islamic way. As a matter of fact, unless one is very sure about the situation, no death sentence cannot be issued unless one is very sure that the person deserves this. And many things should be considered. The factors which contributed to the idea that of the person are very, very important. So I believe that it is only judges and it is only the courts that can decide the death of any person if he deserves death. As a matter of fact, even the idea that adultery deserves death, that is arguable because even the punishment in Islam, it was not carried except very, very few times. And as a matter of fact, if we look to the conditions which have to be fulfilled for such a punishment, it means that it is an impossible punishment. It cannot be inflicted at all because the conditions which are required are not there. How can we know that the person knows first the responsibility? This needs education, socio-cultural circumstances to know really the dignity of the human being, and that the dignity should not be spoiled in this way, and whether the defendant or the victim, all this is missing. So how can we say that we can just kill here and there in the name of honor?
This, I think, is a very good example, the example of this Nigerian woman. This was something that happened more than a year and a half ago. It's a very good example of the misinterpretation of Islamic law. You know, in the end, the woman was acquitted based upon Islamic law. Why? Because it's not possible to accuse a woman of committing adultery unless you have 4 pious witnesses. It's almost impossible to produce 4 pious witnesses who would have witnessed the actual act of sexual intercourse. It's almost impossible. Now, there are Muslim scholars who interpret that law to mean that unless the person who is involved, whether male or female, confesses that he or she had committed adultery, there is no way you can punish a person for adultery, because there's no way you can produce 4 pious witnesses to the actual act of sexual intercourse. Now, there is also an underlying principle in Islamic law that is ignored very often by people who are so obsessed with what I describe as the punitive dimension of Islamic law. In other words, punish the person. This is what dominates their thinking. In almost every instance where law has to be applied in Islamic jurisprudence, there is the principle of forgiveness and reform. In other words, you forgive. That is the noblest of acts. Forgiveness applies even to murder. You know, in Islamic jurisprudence, if X murders Y, the family of Y, they have a right to forgive the murderer. It's not the government, it's not the king or the president who would exercise clemency, who would set the murderer free. It is the family that has got the right, based upon the principle of forgiveness. So that principle of forgiveness, which is linked to the way God is seen in the Quran, the compassionate, the merciful, I think that's the principle that should guide Islamic law. Unfortunately, in Nigeria, as in many other countries that talk about Islamic law and that have tried to implement Islamic law, including Pakistan, you find that the so-called Islamic jurists are obsessed with punishment. They do not look at the underlying values and principles linked to forgiveness, compassion, and mercy, because that, to my mind, is more important.